Hi everybody, Chris here. Today I'm going to be reviewing Andrew Lynn's Classic Philosophy for the Modern Man. And this, as the title suggests, is a philosophy book. And this book has 10 different selections from various philosophers throughout history. Now, a couple things I want to say before I get into the specific contents of the book is firstly that the title is Classic Philosophy for the Modern Man. And while the classic philosophy part is certainly accurate, as well as the modern part is accurate, the man part is not something to get really hung up on. And what I mean by that is the 10 selections are classic philosophy. Some's like not classical, it's modern in the sense of taking place in the 1800s or even 1600s, whatever. But it's classic in the more figurative sense of like it's classic philosophy. And it is modern in the sense that these classic philosophy selections are still relevant today to the modern individual. Now, the only reason I point this out is because it does specify modern man, and the cover has like a Don Draper looking cool cat character on the cover. Which isn't a big deal, but I just want it to be clear that this is really just a general philosophy book for anybody who wishes to read it. But I won't lie, the Men in Black looking secret agent there did probably influence my decision in picking it up in the first place, which is probably why it's marketed like that. But this is a book for everybody. And so now to get into the specifics of it, Andrew Lynn gives, as I said, 10 selections from classic philosophers. He has Plato, and this is all listed on the back of the book and probably in the description if you go to look at it online. Plato, from the selection from the Republic. Aristotle, the Nicomachean Ethics. I always have trouble pronouncing that. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. Not Sun Tzu, like the Art of War, but Chaung, Chuang-Tzu, the Writings of Chuang-Tzu, Machiavelli's The Prince, Castiglione's The Courtier, Gracian's The Art of Worldly Wisdom, Hazlitt's On Success, Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, and lastly, Emerson's Spiritual Laws. And with each chapter, he gives a brief bio of the philosopher, and then he gives a summarized description of the selection, and then he gives you the selection where you can read it yourself from the primary source. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all 10 and give my favorite quote that I found in each, just to sort of give you an idea about what the specific selections are like. And actually, before I do that, I want to point out the fact that this book is concerned with what some would call practical wisdom or practical philosophy. So it's not about like, is this book real or is it a figment of my imagination? It's not analytical philosophy like if this, then therefore this. It's more about how to approach the world, how to approach life. So it's sort of practical wisdom type of stuff. And you'll get a sense of that when I go through the quotes. So at first, I'm actually not going to quote the selection. It's Plato's Allegory of the Cave, famous allegory, which you'll probably hear in any intro to philosophy class you take, if you take one. And Lynn says of it, he says, quote, "It tells us of the process of awakening, which is impeded and interrupted by bouts of pain and denial. And it tells of the alienation and isolation of the awakened one from his fellow men," end quote. Which I think is a good description of the Allegory of the Cave, which is really a must-read for any philosophy fans. So very good selection there. And then from Aristotle, from the Nicomachean Ethics, which apparently was a book that Aristotle wrote for his son, who was named Nicomachean, and it's about like how to be a good person, be a good citizen. So one quote from it that I enjoy, that I think summarizes it a little bit, he says, "Acts of any kind produce habits or characters of the same kind. Hence, we ought to make sure that our acts be of a certain kind." End quote. So Aristotle is saying that, you need to act a certain way, and then he goes on to talk about how one should act of that kind. Now, out of the 10 selection, I'd say that Aristotle is probably the toughest, the most dense and analytical philosopher out of all of these selections. He'll probably be the most troublesome, and he's only in chapter 2, which may dissuade some readers from continuing. But stick through it. It's a good read, and even if you skip Aristotle, the rest of the book is very good. Now, the next selection, the third selection, comes from Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor. And if any of you have seen the movie Gladiator, he's the old man in the beginning of that, who's the emperor of Rome. And he was also very famously a Stoic philosopher. So Lynn provides some excerpts from Aurelius's The Meditations, which, by the way, is one of my all-time favorite books. One of which is, if you are pained by any external thing, it is not this thing that disturbs you, but your own judgment about it. And it is in your power to wipe out this judgment now, end quote. Which is a very Stoic idea about separating the world into two, the things inside your control and the things outside of your control, and only focus about the things that are inside of your control. And I think that as far as practical wisdom goes, anyone who's concerned with practical wisdom needs to at least consider the Stoics, which is why I think Lynn was wise to include parts of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Now, it's not so much a criticism as much as of a wish. If there was ever a second edition to this book, this might be my Stoic bias coming through, but I would like a selection of Seneca's On the Shortness of Life, and or Epictetus's The Manual, and or the opening part of Schopenhauer's The Wisdom of Life. I think those would be great additions to this book on practical wisdom, those selections. But that's just me. So then the fourth is the Chuang-Tzu, who is a Taoist Chinese philosopher. And this is probably my least favorite out of the selections, to be honest. And also, notably, it's the only Eastern philosopher to be he's the only Eastern philosopher to be included in this work, which is a little disappointing because as someone who's read the Buddhists and Confucius, I think they would also, maybe if there's a second edition of this book, it'd be worthwhile to include those thinkers and philosophies as well. But one section from Chuang-Tzu's, the writings of Chuang-Tzu, is called Empty Boats, and he says, quote, "Suppose a boat is crossing a river, and another empty boat is about to collide with it. Even an irritable man would not lose his temper. But supposing there was someone in the second boat, then the occupant of the first would shout to him and keep clear," end quote. And this was really interesting because, it's sort of true that if there's just another boat drifting towards you, your boat, you'd be like, oh, I need to deal with the situation, move my boat out of the way. Whereas if there's someone else, then all of a sudden we get in a fit and we're like, move your boat, you're going to ram into me, blah, blah, blah. And this, again, my Stoic bias coming through, but it really is you control your boat and you don't control the other guy's boat. Or if there's no one in that boat, like that might be symbolic of nature. So I thought that bit was really interesting. And there's some more nice little nuggets of wisdom in Chuang-Tzu's selection here that it's definitely worthwhile reading. Now the fourth is probably my second favorite selection after the Aurelius, which is Machiavelli. Now, even though, Machiavelli's evil and all that, blah, 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 I'm a big Machiavelli fan. He is somewhat Stoic. But in this, I just find Machiavellianism very interesting. As a Game of Thrones fan, favorite character, Tywin Lannister, who's straight up Machiavellian, as well as if you're a fan of House of Cards, the main character, Francis Underwood, super interesting, Machiavellian. And actually, the quote on the cover of this book is Machiavelli. I'll read that first. He says, "A prince, being compelled knowingly to adopt the beast, ought to choose the fox and the lion, because the lion cannot defend himself against snares, and the fox cannot defend himself against wolves. Therefore, it is necessary to be a fox to discover the snares, and a lion to terrify the wolves," which is great. And then the other one I want to read you from Machiavelli is, "There are two ways of contesting, the one by the law, the other by force. The first method is proper to men, the second to beasts. But because the first is frequently not sufficient, It is necessary to have recourse to the second. Therefore, it is necessary for a prince to understand how to avail himself of the beast and the man." End quote. Now, when Machiavelli talks about a prince in his work, The Prince, he's referring to his audience was actually a specific ruler, but more generally, he was talking about rulers in general, which would be a prince at his time. But you can also take his meaning of a prince just to mean an individual, sort of a wise individual, which is how Lynn interprets it. And on that note, as a ruler, it's sort of like, yeah, you want to be diplomatic, but sort of Teddy Roosevelt saying you also want to be able to carry a big stick. And as an individual, you want to be able to argue and debate, but also you might want to be able to use some, rhetorical tricks, be a little nasty, maybe Machiavellian, in order to get your way. So Machiavelli is great. Same as Aurelius. If you're looking for practical wisdom, Machiavelli's The Prince is an excellent resource to go to. And it's great that it's included in the selections of this book. Now, the next one is Castiglione, the Courtier. Now, I had never come across Castiglione until I read this selection. And I'm not going to give a Castiglione quote, but a Lynn description of it. He says, "The courtier asks a simple but important question. What makes the ideal man? Castiglione's answer describes what he has come to be known as a Renaissance man." So Castiglione talks about how it's better to be a Renaissance man who sort of knows a lot of everything. And that's what that selection is about. Which is really interesting, I thought. Good read. Now the next is probably my third favorite. It comes from Gracian. Let me get to this page first. Now, I actually bought his book, The Art of Worldly Wisdom, after reading the selection in this book. I had never come across Gracian prior to reading this, but I was really impressed, so I picked it up. Now, Gracian, he's like a less ambitious, less evil, but more practical version of Machiavelli, essentially. And The Art of Worldly Wisdom, he talks about just some practical tips for getting through life, getting through the world. And it's Ballastar Gracian is his name. Now, let me give you a good quote here. Okay. So, no, that's not what I wanted, actually. Okay. "Very wise folk are generally easily deceived, for while they know out-of-the-way things, they do not know the ordinary things of life, which are much more needful. The observation of higher things leaves them no time for things close at hand. Since they know not the very first thing they should know, and what everybody knows so well, they are either considered or thought ignorant by the superficial multitude." End quote. Now, a lot of philosophers actually might look at this and be like, oh yeah, the superficial multitude, like that's why it's better to be wise. But Gracian is actually taking the opposite approach. He's saying, no, it's not good to be to have all this higher knowledge and be considered ignorant by the masses. It's better to be sort of conformed to the masses, or at least appear to be, because you don't want to be looked at, and that's very practical. I mean, you don't want to be looked at as an outsider, as someone with your heads in the clouds. I thought that not only was that a great quote, but I think that is a perfect quote to sort of symbolize the purpose of this book. Lynn is very concerned with practical wisdom and getting through life and practical concerns. And there was one other Gracian quote I wanted to give you from the book. "Folly consists not in committing folly, but in not hiding it when committed. You should keep your desires sealed up. Still more, your defects. Reputation depends more on what is hidden than on what is done." So he's concerned very much with how you appear to others, which, good or bad, some people will be like, oh, that's terrible, but it is a very practical concern in society, because we live in a society. So, you kind of need to be concerned with how you appear. Now, the next one is Hazlitt. And Hazlitt is very much along the lines of Gracian with practical wisdom. He's probably not as good as Gracian, but it's definitely worth the read. And one quote I wanted to point out, he says, quote, "It avails little that there may be internal qualities, since all that the observer sees is the exterior man," end quote. Which again is on the same lines as Gracian. it doesn't really matter what's on the inside, unfortunately. The reality of the situation is what's on the outside that counts. It's what you do that defines you, as Rachel Dawes might say. Rachel Dawes might say. So Hazlitt's a good read, good selection. The next comes from Nietzsche, which is really interesting. It's Friedrich Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil. Now, I've read Nietzsche elsewhere, and in this selection, he talks about the difference between what he calls slave morality, and what is it? I think it's, what's the other one he calls it? Forgive me for a second. Okay, master morality. Now, master morality is sort of the ruling class. Now, if you're in charge of ruling class, then you consider to be good whatever benefits the ruling class, and you consider to be bad or dishonorable what doesn't. So what he's saying is that the ruling class kind of defies good and bad. He's a little bit of a relativist there. Whereas slave morality, he says, is slave morality, quote, slave morality is essentially the morality of utility, end quote. So if you're less privileged, not if you're the least privileged, there could be people below you, but if you're not on top, then you consider morality to be the good of everybody. And that isn't because you're a benevolent person, it's just because you don't get to define what's good, because you're not on top. And until you're on top, you think that, oh, whatever's good for everybody, whatever's good for the whole society, we should all help each other, essentially. Like, if you're not on top, you're like, oh, you need to help me, and we need to all be one, kumbaya. But then once you're on top, you're like, what's good is good for me. Which I think is very interesting, very practical, even if not idealistic. It's, Nietzsche is sort of like hits you in the face, and like, this is the reality. And the last one, the 10th selection, is from Emerson. Emerson has some interesting thoughts as well in this book. One good quote from Emerson, I thought, was, quote, "What we do not call education is more precious than that which we call so." And what he's saying there is what you learn in school is a very small amount of what you actually know and what you would consider to be your knowledge. And you learn most things just through doing stuff and, with your friends, family, etc. And there's some other great stuff in Emerson. So I hope you got a taste for the 10 different selections there, which might have sold you into buying or at least getting from the library, because support your local library. Andrew Lynn's Classic Philosophy for the Modern Man. Now, a little bit on the thing as a whole. As I said, it's for anybody, not just men. It's a great introductory book. If you're just getting into philosophy, I would highly, highly recommend Andrew Lynn's Classic Philosophy for the Modern Man. The only caveat to that is it is like more practical wisdom based. So if you only read this and then you start maybe looking more into analytical philosophy, epistemology, metaphysics, etc., even ethics, you might be a little like hit in the face and like, whoa, this book didn't prepare me for that stuff. But it's still a really interesting read. And if you're already very much into philosophy, as I was when I picked up this book, I encountered many thinkers that I had never even heard of, much less read in this book. So, and like I said that, and I went out and bought Gracian's The Art of Worldly Wisdom. So I highly recommend Andrew Lynn's Classic Philosophy for the Modern Man. I'm going to rate it 4 out of 5 stars. And I made a video a bit earlier, a while ago, on my top 10 books for someone getting into philosophy. And if I were to remake that video, I would probably try my best to include this in some way. I'm not sure what I would knock off that video, off the list of top 10. But as I said, Andrew Lynn's book is very good for getting into philosophy. It's concise, it has simple language, practical wisdom. It's an excellent read. This would make a great Christmas gift or something like that, I would say. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and check out some more of my videos.